Welcome to the Bible Passages Podcast.
This was an important city, a rich heritage of Greek history.
Modern Thessaloniki, which sits on the ancient city of Thessalonica, is the second largest city in Greece.
There's this modern city, and then right in the middle of it is just a little bit of archaeological unearthing that's taken place.
The remains of the ancient city, however, still speak to us about the events that occurred there during the time of Paul and the apostles.
Paul came here, and just like today, going to be a lot of people coming in and out of here and then going out to the neighboring communities.
We hope you'll enjoy this episode of the Bible Passages Podcast.
Those Christians still had an impact on the world for good. Man, let that be a lesson for all of us today.
Hey, John, how's it going today?
Hey, Brian, things are going great. Busy. I feel like I'm going in all kinds of directions, but man, what a blessing it is to be able to be in ministry and just to be able to do a lot of different things, and then to come on to be able to talk to you today about some great stuff. So, yeah, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I have a quick question. What is the weather in Texas today?
Today it is probably around, I don't know, upper 70s. It get a little cold front the other day, but man, hot, cold, hot, cold. Is it snowing there in Denver?
It is not snowing today, but it will be 50 degrees, melting off about 18 inches of snow that we got last week. So just a little contrast in climates there.
Yeah.
Uh, um, as we kind of get into this, we're talking about Thessalonica today, and got a kind of a question or maybe a confession. I struggle with Thessalonica, because it is such a modern city. Did you have any of that issue when you were getting ready for this episode?
Yeah, I mean, even just going there, the first time that I visited there, and I remember reading up on it, and I've taught First and Second Thessalonians before at Bear Valley Bible Institute, and so I'm a history buff, archaeology interest, and um, so I'd done my research and had known that there just weren't a whole lot of archaeological remains. Right, it doesn't have that big bang for the buck in terms of visuals of the ancient world like Athens does, or Philippi even to some extent, even though it's still kind of small. But as you know, I mean, it's like there's this modern city, and then right in the middle of it is just a little bit of archaeological unearthing that's taken place at a forum. But there's some other cool things about it. But yeah, it's challenging. So I think today, trying to help maybe listeners make a connection between what's there and how that's going to be, help them to better understand Scripture. That might be a challenge for us. So we'll see. But I'm excited about talking about it.
Yeah, well, and I am excited to talk about it, but it's hard to, again, kind of put yourself in context sometimes in these modern cities, but it is such an important city, of course, because of the events that take place in Acts chapter 17. So uh, just quickly, I know many are familiar with it, but in Acts chapter 17, Paul comes to Thessalonica. He's traveling down the Via Ignatia. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but he arrives, and it says for at least 3 Sabbaths, he reasoned with the Jews in the synagogue. As was the case in a lot of places, the Jews did not always react favorably to the message, and that was no different in the case of Thessalonica. They get upset. The text says that they were actually jealous because Paul and his message and his following, and in their aggravation, which is probably an understatement, in their jealousy, they get very, very mad, and they search for Paul and Silas. They can't find him. They find a man named Jason, and they drag him out of his house and take him to the city officials and accuse him of upsetting the natural order of things. And Paul has to get out of Dodge pretty quickly so that the Jewish leaders can't find him, and he moves on to Berea. And again, that's all found in Acts chapter 17. So it's an important place, and there's a lot of interesting things about that account that we can link to archaeology and to the site. But it is very much a modern city. So, John, what are your impressions of the modern city of Thessaloniki?
Well, let me, Brian, if I could, just one more other sort of biblical context to all of this. Remember that it's when Paul's on his second missionary tour, as you've mentioned, probably roughly around 50 AD when he comes through there, and then as you just identified in Acts, he has been driven out. He ends up in Corinth, and he's obviously anxiously awaiting the news from Timothy and Silas about, because he had sent them back to help out with the church there. It's a fledgling small congregation of God's people that, brand new Christians. And so he's deeply concerned because of the persecution, what has happened there. We want to talk about what has been discovered there that might give us some indication of that. And so he writes these letters, First and Second Thessalonians, these epistles, to strengthen them in the faith. And as he actually identifies that a couple of times in the text, I wanted to supply what was lacking in your faith, and I was concerned about your situation. And then he gets news back that they're actually doing pretty well. And he writes Second Thessalonians, I heard that from you, sounded out the word of the Lord from, in all the region of Macedonia, that, that you turn from idols. That's another important thing I think that we need to kind of maybe give some consideration to when we're studying and thinking about what's there, what's been discovered, to think about that in light of these letters, First and Second Thessalonians, and some of the things that Paul says. So
It's really good to know the biblical context. And, sometimes you go to a city like Athens or even Jerusalem to some extent, and there's a lot more there than you maybe find in the biblical narrative. And then sometimes it's the other way around, right? We know a lot about Thessalonica because of what we find in Acts chapter 17, because of what we read in First and Second Thessalonians. So it's interesting how those kind of play, and maybe it's just in my own mind that I categorize those cities in that way. But I think especially I you learn a lot about the narrative in Thessalonica, and kind of where I was going. I want to talk a little bit about the modern city of Thessaloniki. So Thessaloniki is over top of what used to be Thessalonica, and we'll talk a little bit about the archaeology in a second. But it is the second largest city in Greece. The modern city is, and it's a college town. I think I read that there's more than 60,000 undergraduates that are living in Thessaloniki, studying in Thessaloniki. I do remember we were on a train. I believe is coming back from one trip, and we got to talking with a local from Rome, and she had just come back from Thessaloniki on holiday. It's a destination place. It's a college town. It's a port city. There's a lot that you can find about it. John, I asked you earlier, but now maybe what are your impressions of the modern city of Thessaloniki?
yeah, well, I mean, first of all, yeah, there's a lot there to see and to do. When you think about a large city, it's the second largest city in all of Greece today. Um, you know, Lots of great places to eat. There's a big hub of activity. Think about where it's located on this harbor, which ought to tie us back in to some biblical themes as well. Thinking about the fact that Paul is going to come there because this is an intersection. It's a place where trade and commerce occur, just like today. But to answer your question, I was not hugely impressed. One of the things that we've discussed before is the huge amount of graffiti that is everywhere. It's almost almost a part of the culture there, in a large part of the city, to see it in so many areas, and no one's really doing anything about it. So it detracts to me away from the beauty of the city. Now you get down close to the harbor, and you can see the beautiful ocean, and there's a park and a walkway down there close to that area. So that's nice, to take that in. But and then intermixed, it's just sort of strange to see right in the middle of the town this um, old Roman Forum, and then the Arch of Galerius, one of the UNESCO's World Heritage sites. It's not huge, but it's an iconic um, image in the city that people, you go up and down. In fact, when you travel up and down the main road, kind of east to west in present day Thessalonica, you're going really where that Via Ignatia, the old Roman road, went. And as you do today and pass down that main road, you see that big arch that we'll talk about in a moment, and then the rotunda off in the background, Galerius's rotunda, which some people say was basically a temple at first to maybe Zeus. Um, but so a few remains like that here and there, and then the big wall around the city that's much later than the Apostle Paul, but the ancient the remains of that wall. So a little bit of antiquity mixed in with a lot of modern. Maybe that's the way I would describe it.
Well, I think that's a great way to describe it because I mean, I think of a city like Richmond in the United States, and of course, that's a hometown for me. And you can be driving and you can see modern buildings next to something from, maybe the Revolutionary era, or you can't go back too much further than that. But it's kind of old stuff mixed in with the new. Well, Thessaloniki is a lot like that, except the old stuff is a couple thousand years old instead of a couple hundred years old. Um, I think that a city kind of takes on a little bit of its roots. We talked about this with Athens, even today, Athens has a little bit of the flavor that it had 2,000 years ago. And I think Thessaloniki is the same way with Thessalonica. You mentioned its position. So I want to talk a little bit about its geography. It is on the sea, so it is a port city, obviously very important in antiquity. And if you'll allow me to talk about the Grecian peninsula as a T, with the north south route being the peninsula, and then the T part is actually that land route that goes all the way from Istanbul to north of Italy. That northern part, the east-west running route, is the Via Ignatia, and we've talked a little bit about that before. Massive road that actually connects Rome all the way to Istanbul, and it is the major east-west trade route in this part of the world. But then also there's a north-south route that's not as, well known, or doesn't have as common a name as the Via Ignatia, but it connects that northern part of Greece to the southern part of Greece. Well, right there at the intersection is Thessaloniki. So, or Thessalonica. So you have this east-west trade route, you have this north-south trade route, and you have a port right there. Massively important city, very strategic in its location, and those are the kind of places that Paul liked to go. There's a lot of people there. There's a lot of trade there. The gospel is going to be able to permeate in a lot of different areas, but also there's a heavy Jewish presence that's going to be in this city as well because it's so big. Um, John, what else do you think we need to know?
That's an important point to make. Just like today, back then, Thessalonica was hugely important, not only because of it being on the crossroads of trade, but all around the outside of the area, there are some still today a lot of crops being grown. It's an agricultural place, so it sort of spilled out into the area around Thessalonica, where farmers could come in and sell their goods. So agriculturally, trade as far as the commerce is concerned, and then I would say also in terms of its past, its history. So if we're studying through, and you're someone studying through First and Second Thessalonians or Acts 17, and they want to have a better understanding of this context, know the geography, know that it's important in terms of its location, and know that Paul came here as a great place to meet a lot of people, so that it can then spill out into the other, neighboring communities. Like Second Thessalonians 1 said that, and from you, all of Macedonia, which is a province, Thessalonica is the capital during this time. Paul's preaching, it's the capital of the province of Macedonia. So people are coming in and out of there for business purposes, but also for governmental purposes, to obtain maybe a charter, to turn, a license to do something, or to obtain some sort of paperwork to be able to do something for the government. This is where you go, right? So there's going to be a lot of people coming in and out of here, and then going out to the neighboring communities. And just like today, so Paul comes here now, knowing its place in Scripture, knowing its geographic location, but also something about its past. You want to talk a little bit about that? I think is that will help us to appreciate um, our understanding of Scripture.
So when I think about the past of Thessalonica, the first thing that I'm reminded of is it very much followed the path of a lot of other cities of antiquity, and that is it was founded, and then it was part of a Greek empire, and then it was part of a Roman empire. So Thessalonica in the area of Macedonia, that northern part of Greece, was very much a Greek city, had a lot of Greek influence. And then when the Romans come to town, they basically retain most of the Greek influence and just rename them all Roman things. So we talked about an agora gets changed to a forum, the Odeon, which is a place where there would be plays and things like that, gets changed into an arena for gladiatorial fights. And so it was a Greek city, and then it became a Roman city, obviously retaining a lot of that Greek influence. And so when I think about visiting Thessalonica, the main area, the main archaeological area is the old Roman Forum that you find. And again, it's kind of right there in the heart of the city. You park in, a modern street and you get out in a modern city and you walk down, and then there's an area that is preserved as the Roman Forum. There's a few pillars. There's a little bit of a museum or a site down there. The Odeon that I just mentioned is on the as you're kind of facing it coming down the street. It's on your left, and it's not huge, but you can definitely tell that there's a Roman forum there, right? If you've seen other Roman forums in places like Philippi or Athens or even Rome itself, you can tell that there's a forum there. And just a reminder, that's kind of a marketplace, an area where most people would do their business. um, John, what do you think about that site?
Which, by the way, I think that could very well be the place where Jason was brought, Act 17, right, and the riot that ensues when people are upset about Paul and them coming, saying these are the ones that have turned the world upside down. The Jews have stirred up the city, and now they're brought before the magistrates. So probably somewhere in that area, maybe where he was brought. But I do want to also mention this, as you were talking about what all it can be seen in the modern day city of Thessalonica. If you go a little bit closer to the harbor, there is a large statue. It's a modern statue of Alexander the Great, and to me, that's extremely important to understand and recognize his influence in that whole region, but especially with Thessalonica, because his father, Philip of Macedon, who was from this general area, actually won a huge battle here, and because of the horsemen of the of the people of Thessalonica, the Thessalians. Um, he actually named this city in honor of them, and also because of Alexander the Great's half sister who had this name. The word Thessaly or Nike means victory, and then the Thessalians after the horsemen from that area. And I'm mentioning that because in the minds of a lot of people in that area of the Greek Empire, this was an important city that represented in some ways a Greek independence and a time of glory when a lot of the city states were united under one kingdom, and this was a place of victory. Okay, a rich heritage of Greek history is associated with this place. Now, why is that important in terms of the New Testament? Because, as we know, you mentioned Rome taking over this place, and they did so about 168 BC. They come here and they eventually award this city the status of being a free city. So they can mint their own coins, they can do a lot of their own administrative things, they retain a lot of their own culture, their own religious practices, which we want to talk about in a moment. And so that was a very tenuous kind of relationship. Hey, we want to retain this. We have a lot of rights, a lot of ability to form our own government, to do things in our own way, but we know that we can't upset the apple cart with regard to the Roman Empire. We need to pay homage to Rome, and in particular to some of the emperors, right, that are going to be, have claimed themselves to be divine or have been proclaimed as divine by the Senate. And so this delicate balance between, we don't want to upset Rome because they could come in and just crush us and start a new colony like they did the Carthaginians, or they did at Philippi and establish a new city there. We want to retain our Greek roots, and we don't want to upset Rome. And so now, if someone comes in and they're preaching that there's another emperor or another king, this Jesus, and Rome has sort of got their eye on this place, going, well, we don't want the Greeks thinking that they can somehow gain their own independence again, or that they think they're better than the Romans in some way. You see what I'm saying in terms of the political balance? Am I describing that in a way that maybe is helpful?
In some ways, Rome politics are simple, and in some ways, they're extremely difficult to understand. But I like to think of it in terms of levels. And what I mean by that is basically Rome has some political levers that they can pull for cooperation of the cities that they've conquered. The more cooperative you are, the more freedom you enjoy. And so I always think of Palestine and Jerusalem, especially with the Maccabean revolt and some other things that have happened there. The Jews saw Palestine as almost like a hostile witness in court. They're not all that sympathetic to Rome. They don't like Rome, and so there's a heavier presence of Roman soldiers there. There's a heavier presence of Roman officials that are there to govern the region and keep peace. Well, Thessalonica is on the other end of that spectrum. They're very sympathetic to Rome. They pay their taxes. They operate. They're good citizens, and so Rome gave them a ton of freedom. And as John already mentioned, or as you already mentioned, John, the status of a free city, that actually comes into to play something that Luke mentions in Acts 17. And I think um, it's probably worth going there right now. But in Acts 17, when they drag Jason out of his house and they take him, maybe to the forum, as we've kind of already implied, it says that they take him to the rulers of the city, the leaders of the city, and it calls them the Politarchs. And that's actually a really interesting word because it's not a Roman official. They're not taking him to uh, a governor or a proconsul or anything like that. They're taking him to the Politarchs. And that word is actually a pretty rare word in antiquity. It's not found in very many places. Actually, I don't know that it's been found much outside of this one reference in Acts chapter 17, and so people have used that a lot to try to discredit the Bible. They've said, "Well, Luke didn't know what he was talking about."
No, I appreciate you bringing that up, and let's back up just a moment because you were making reference to Acts 17, and I think it makes a great point with what I was mentioning. And when he says in verse 7, and Jason received them, and they're all acting, these Jews are saying, against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus, right? So that status, again, going back to the statue we saw of Alexander the Great, and the fact that his influence was so great there, and now these Greeks are still able to retain a bit of their history, retain this freedom. They don't want to upset Rome, and so the Jews know what buttons to push. When Paul comes in and he says, "There is this King Jesus, right? We want you to follow Jesus," and the Jews don't like that. Well, what's the best way to get the local officials upset? Is to say, "Oh, they're telling us there's another Caesar," and they know that the local officials aren't going to like that. Okay, now let's talk about those local officials. You're right. There is a unique term that Luke utilizes here that uh, critics had pointed to in the past, suggesting that Luke just wasn't very accurate because he didn't use a term that was often associated with a number of Roman cities throughout the empire, and now he uses this term. That's it's kind of a rare term to use. Why did he use that term in a city that's highly Romanized in many ways? Well, we know now that Luke was exactly right with a discovery that was made in the late 1800s. You might want to double check me on the time there. I was trying to remember that a moment ago, but
1887, if I've
what
got
what
my
year? What year?
1887, if I've got
1887.
my
Um,
facts straight.
Yeah, you can't go to the actual location where it was discovered today, but as they're excavating the city and as the city is growing and developing all that. Unfortunately, things that were in a state of ruin aren't always preserved, and so they find this entrance on the western side of the city, an old gateway entryway, and on that gateway there is this unique inscription that was found that actually uh, dates to the time of the Apostle Paul in that era, and it lists a number of the leaders of the city, and the leaders of that city are called the Politarchs, exactly the word that Luke used in Acts 17. So Luke was right. The Bible is trustworthy. It is something that, we know down to the meticulous detail that Luke used the exact terms. Now, with regard to the church at Philippi or the letter to the Philippians and then what Paul says, I'm sorry, what Luke says in Acts 16, he uses different terms for the magistrates and the rulers there because those were the terms that were used there that were different from those in Thessalonica. I mean, do you think that if someone were asking you right now to give me all the titles of people in a particular county in Texas that are used versus ones that are used in Virginia or Colorado? I mean, in some instances we know, like there's the mayor, but what about some of the other levels of officials and rulers? It can change sometimes from state to state. That'd be tough. I don't know that I could do that, right? Um, think about Luke doing that in that day and age. How could he be so precise? How could he get it right every time? It's because he was inspired of God, and God is all seeing, all sovereign, all knowing, and so Luke writes these things because God is telling him what to write.
It's so amazing how often that those things happen. We've talked about in other episodes the verisimilitude, the things that represent um, they're close matches to what Luke said. Again, archaeology being somewhat difficult to pin down, but this artifact, now called the Politarch inscription, is exactly what Luke wrote in Acts 17. They match exactly. And John, I'm gonna maybe break script here for a joke. My favorite archaeology joke. Do you know why the pyramids are in Egypt? Because they were too heavy to go back to London.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. That's where the Politarch inscription is, yeah,
If
yeah.
you are lost as you can be, if you wanna know where most artifacts are, guess the British Museum in London. That is where the Politarch inscription is.
Yeah.
John mentioned,
By the way, just to add to that, since we're
yeah.
on, dumb jokes that, you know, everybody wants, the British Museum to give their things back and because they think they're theirs, but they're in a state of denial with regard to the pyramids, right, and the Egyptian artifacts. The denial, get it? Denial. Okay, never mind. Alright, let's keep
No.
moving, yeah.
Oh, we'll see how many jokes make it in future episodes here.
Yeah, probably not many.
I do want to, and it's a good thing to mention just briefly because I think you were hinting at this. Um, the British Museum does get a lot of probably well deserved criticism for their hoarding of antiquities, but also they claim, and there's some truth to their claim, that they preserved a lot of these things, and it's true, right? They sent people to places that were sometimes in a state of disrepair, sometimes in war zones, sometimes in kind of dire circumstances, and they preserve things like this. So when it comes down to it, obviously I would like the Politarch inscription to be in Thessalonica where I can go see it, but I'm glad we have it at all. And to have it in the British Museum is better than to not have it at all. So we give them a hard time, but again, to kind of sum all this up, Luke was accurate in what he wrote. We find archaeological evidence of that in Thessalonica. And if you want to see that artifact, it is preserved today, and you can find that in the British Museum. So, kind of a neat connection that's there. Um, Another thing I want to talk about just briefly is some archaeological evidence for a synagogue. So, uh, the finding of Jewish synagogues is kind of a archaeological milestone, if you will. It's often a question that gets asked. It's often something that archaeologists are looking for. Well, I believe to date, no evidence of a synagogue itself has been found in Thessalonica, and that's largely because the ancient city is underneath the modern city. There was, however, a plaque that dates, and I believe this is second century, maybe third century AD, that refers to a synagogue in that city. And synagogues often, if there was a second century or third century synagogue, it's often because it was built right on top of what was a first century AD or first century BC or even later synagogue. They just built those right in the same place, and it could have been destroyed due to war or earthquake or things like that. So all of that to say, there's been a plaque that was found that talks about a synagogue, and that's as much evidence as we have. But of course, Luke writes that Paul was in the synagogue for 3 Sabbaths reasoning with the Jews. So we know that there was at least enough Jewish men to have a synagogue in Thessalonica. And we found just a small piece of evidence that points to one in the second and third century, which gives credence, again, this verisimilitude to the idea that there was a synagogue there. So, John, is there any other archaeological evidence you want to talk about, or you think we need to talk about?
So, I mean, there's several things, and we definitely want to fast forward here in just a moment in terms of history to not forget to talk about church history and some things that happened with regard to the Roman Empire, and then its transformation over into the Byzantine era. And but before we leave this New Testament era, talked about the geographic location, talked about some of the discoveries there that coincide with Scripture, like the Politarch inscription. It's the fact that it enjoyed this unique relationship with the Roman Empire as a free city. Sorry, that's the teaching part of me coming out, right? The summary things here, but then there's another element from the archaeological record there that can be seen in the local archaeological museum, and that is the discovery of coins and uh, and then other inscriptions that tell us this very important point, and that is Thessalonica was also highly religious, filled with pagan theology. And not only were their discoveries and references from history to Greek and Roman gods, so the Greek Roman pantheon, people like Zeus and others were worshipped there. Aphrodite, Dionysus, the goddess of wine, Asclepius, the god of medicine, and so forth. But also, some coins have been discovered from that first century era with the head of Augustus on there. And one of the coins actually mentions that there was a temple dedicated to Caesar in this area. So when we're studying through the book of Revelation, we're studying through these New Testament letters, we have to remember that these early Christians faced the problem of cult emperor worship. I remember as a young boy growing up in the church and then in college hearing a lot about cult emperor worship, and thought, well, that's interesting. Did anybody ever really, check this out? Is it just one of those things we say that Christians had to face the cultural view that emperors had become gods, like Augustus when he dies, or when Julius Caesar dies, and then he's deified by the Senate, and the same thing happens with Augustus. They're worshipped as gods, and even when Augustus was alive at the time of Jesus, he claimed himself to be the son of a god. So there is this divine element connected to these emperors, and now there are temples erected in honor of these individuals. They're worshiped as gods. That's a point that we cannot overlook and we cannot emphasize enough. Imagine the cultural, societal pressure that Christians felt as they not only wanted to be a part of certain trade guilds who had gods that were honored among those trade guilds, and if you wanted to buy and sell and trade your wares, and you had to pay allegiance to those gods if you wanted to continue to have that connection, but you couldn't do it as a Christian, right? Or maybe people in your community are sensing that you don't really think much of the emperor. Maybe you go to a game at the Hippodrome or to some sort of athletic competition, and you or the games begin with an honor homage paid to the bust of Caesar that's paraded around, and everybody says and raises their hand and says, "Hail Caesar!" But they notice that you don't do it. That you're not doing it. Who are you? Why aren't you acknowledging Caesar? Are you wanting to bring harm on our city? Do you want to offend Caesar? I mean, he's God. Why aren't you worshiping him? And so maybe this bit of suspicion then is sort of cast upon Christians, and they might lose their livelihood, or maybe they might be spat upon or spoken in an evil way, just like we read in First Thessalonians. That's what was happening. Paul said he was shamefully treated at Philippi. Then he comes to Thessalonica, and the Jews stir up the Romans to persecute them, and again say that they're telling us to do things that are contrary to Caesar. So the archaeological record bears out on some of these coins, as well as in the writings of ancient historians, that these emperors were worshipped, that they were deified, that they were honored in a place like Thessalonica. So don't forget that when you go there, that's the culture, the environment that Christians were facing, a highly religious, highly political society that was diametrically opposed to theirs. They were a subset, a subculture of a larger culture that was different from the Christian culture.
It may seem you and I talk about this a lot, and it may seem like we're kind of standing on it, but I don't know that we have a modern equivalent. And just to kind of sum up, and then maybe we'll move to some church history stuff. All of these things fold in together, right? Rome wants subservient cities. So they provide those cities with benefits if they are sympathetic, and they provide them or take away those benefits if they are not sympathetic. And so we're talking about tax benefits. We're talking about the reduced pressure of the military or presence of the military. We're talking about the ability to govern yourselves, like we said, the ability to mint your own coins. But unlike ours, kind of what John is talking about, politics and religion and military are all folded into one. We think of those as three separate things, but they're all folded into one. And so that saying we say all the time, don't upset the apple cart. Well, anything that is an affront to any of those things, the politics or the religion or the military, is going to upset the apple cart. And Rome had very little patience with that. So again, the societal pressure is massive. That's why they bring Jason out of his house. That's why they say that really powerful phrase that these men have turned the world upside down. Well, what world is that? That's the Roman world, and they really did turn that upside down. But as time goes on, the sympathy changes. So let's talk a little bit about church history, and I want to put it in its broader context, and then John, maybe you can give us some more specifics. Remember that from the first century to the fourth century, so we're talking about 100, 200, 300 AD, and really kind of post 70 AD. Christians are going to be persecuted heavily by the Roman Empire. And sometimes that's systematic, broad, everywhere in the empire, but more often it's isolated in pockets, or it is um, heavier sometimes and less heavy other times. And it all really has to do with how, again, sympathetic your city is viewed towards Rome, and also what the general culture and context of the city is. So we read of the persecution that's going to happen in Revelation. Well, that happens again from roughly 100 to 300 AD. During that time, Rome is facing its own issues. And one of those issues is what John and I talk about all the time, is this problem of time and distance. How do we manage such a large empire? Well, basically that becomes so large, so hard to manage that they split the Roman Empire into four pieces. And I don't want to talk too much more about that, but what's important to know about that is Thessalonica becomes the capital of one of these four pieces of the Roman Empire. And an important emperor then named Galerius comes to rule right here in Thessalonica. So that gives us the Arch of Galerius. So John, you want to talk a little bit about any more about that Roman history, or maybe about what the arch is and what it represents?
So right in Thessalonica today, or as they say in the, there, Thessaloniki, right in Thessaloniki, on that Via Ignatia, uh, as a part of an ancient complex built by Galerius, and who, it comes to the throne at around 300. He's actually a Caesar before that, as a part of the, the tetrarchy that existed that you mentioned. And but there is a commemorative arch built for him because he helped defend the kind of the northeastern part of the Roman Empire from invasion. So there is this reminder of the Roman presence in the world and the things that they achieved and what they did. Now, two things right now that I want us to remember is, as we mentioned, this delicate balance between local cultures and the Roman Empire. The Romans created this treaty system, and it's a part of what made them last as long as they did. When they went to a nation to conquer it, they didn't make the mistakes of some previous empires and just sort of, made everyone acquiesce to everything that they did and had to adopt their culture completely. But instead, they allowed them to retain some of their own culture and religious practices and their own temples. Allah, you mentioned the Jews in Jerusalem. They're able to keep their temple for a while, but you have to pay your taxes to Rome. You don't want to, we want to utilize your trade. There's this symbiotic relationship that exists. But if you rebel and you continue to cause us a problem, then we're going to come in and destroy you. But that was kind of a last resort. So that unique relationship exists. And as they grow and they get bigger and they're bigger and bigger and bigger, right, and conquering all the way to Spain, up in the northern territories of Europe, like modern day France and Germany, how do you control that vast amount of territory? It became a challenge for the Roman Empire. And so Diocletian was the first one to actually divide it up into four quadrants, so that with two Augustuses and two Caesars, as they were called, to rule. Now, that's been going on up until that, because Diocletian comes to the throne around 284. But something else happens. He realizes that their past is not what it used to be. They're not as strong. They're not as glorious as the days of Caesar Augustus, or of Octavian, and the days of the second century, when they were really growing and the empire was. Things are struggling, and you know who gets the blame for that, Brian? Christians, right? Some of the Christians get the blame for that, because Christianity is growing all during this period, and they've been persecuted at times, not always empire wide. But if there's a problem, and as at Thessalonica, then we're going to persecute them because we don't want to upset that apple cart. But now we come to a period in history in which there is a empire-wide systematic effort to stamp out Christianity, because Diocletian says Christianity is the problem here. It's the reason why we aren't what we used to be. And so he decides that he's going to burn all the Bibles, destroy all the church buildings, because there have been now a few church buildings that have been built and property owned by Christians. They're integrated with the Roman society in many places, but now we're going to stamp them out. All right. Well, he wasn't successful, and thought that he was at first, but then realized that they couldn't do it. So eventually, Galerius and Constantine, who comes to a position of great influence out in the West, they issue an edict of toleration, and then the Edict of Milan, that now allows Christianity to be legal again. And now we're going to return some of their property and things like that to them. So Galerius is focused here in this area. And what he does at Thessalonica is he builds a tremendous complex, has this rotunda built that is a temple that eventually becomes a church building, because after Christianity dies out, I'm sorry, after the paganism begins to die out a little bit, little by little, um, Constantine, who comes to the throne in roughly 318 or so, he says, if we can't beat them, let's join them, and so he adopts Christianity, but he still allows paganism to continue, as do successive or subsequent emperors, until a guy by the name of Theodosius, ruling out of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, comes to the throne and decides, I'm going to make Christianity the state religion, and anybody that opposes us, we're going to stamp out. We're now going to persecute pagans. And one of the places where that happens and is so highly visible is right here at Thessalonica. There is a disturbance over the doctrine and the view of Jesus, but there's also the belief and the view that the pagans have created some of this and caused some of this problem, and so there's a massacre of some 7,000 people that occur at the ancient hippodrome, which you can see the outline of today when you go there, not too far from the harbor, where that massacre took place, and so I'm mentioning all that to say that Thessalonica plays a significant and important role in the events that follow after the establishment of the church in the first century. Okay. I know that was convoluted and when I went all over the place, but I think what people need to know is that when we go to these places and visit them, we don't just talk about first century Christianity in the biblical world. We also try to make connections about things that happened there in the centuries that followed. And so that we understand, how did the Greek Orthodox Church develop and why? With this East and West division and the tetrarchy and all of that happens. One last thing I'll mention about that big, beautiful rotunda of Galerius that was built is that, and if you go there, you've got to go on the inside of it, because in some ways it reminds me of the Pantheon in Rome. But the architectural features of it are tremendous. It was built as a temple at first, at least that's the initial thought, to Zeus. Some say, well, Galerius really wanted it, who is an emperor of Rome at this point. He says, I'm going to build this as my mausoleum, as a burial place. But then when Christianity becomes the dominant religion, what do? They make it a church building. And that church building is later on dedicated to George of Lydda. Lydda is a place in Israel, and he comes over there and he is persecuted. He's first known as for in Diocletian's army, and for Galerius was a great military leader, but he adopts Christianity. And when the Romans find out about this in this period of the persecution we were talking about that happens under Diocletian and then partly under Galerius, what do? They persecute him unmercifully, trying to get him to recant, but he refuses to do so, and he dies the martyr's death. And as a result of that, he becomes this huge iconic figure in church history that particularly is, as we've noted in a previous session about Athens, is honored there as one of their patron saints. And now in Thessalonica, this rotunda is named after him. They call it St. George of Lydda, and people go there and worship there today. They worship God, but they honor George as well.
I kind of mentioned at the beginning about how I struggle with Thessalonica, and the reason is, and this is kind of just summarizing again, when you go, most of the ancient city is underneath the modern city, so in all likelihood, it's never going to see the light of day, because nobody's going to tear down an office building to uncover some archaeology. But hopefully, you can see that when we start talking about learning geography or learning history or learning about the archaeology of a specific place, the depth of information is almost staggering. And the reason is because we're talking about over a long period of time, right? We talked about an ancient period, then we talked about that, and they're all ancient periods, but we talked about a BC period, we talked about an AD period, we talked about then into the second, third, fourth century AD. Thessalonica really played a large part in each of those eras. And so, what we're talking about when you go to visit, the harbor is, like John said, a cool thing to visit because shorelines don't change a ton, right? The water that Paul would have seen is the water that we see. So those kind of things don't change a ton. There's obviously the wall, there's the Roman Forum, and then there's this church history piece, artifacts that we can still see that are very, very old still, like this arch, like this rotunda, but are associated with periods that are hundreds of years after um, the time of Paul and when he came there. I want to mention one thing, and then I want to make a connection, and then I think John will probably have to wrap up as we're uh, coming in for a landing here. But I would be remiss in saying, maybe we haven't painted a great picture of Thessaloniki, the city, right? The archaeology is sparse. The graffiti is everywhere, but two really bright spots. One is I've heard great things about the archaeological museum. I haven't been personally, but I've heard really really good things about that. So I think it's worth a visit. And the second one is, as we have talked about on previous episodes, I am kind of a foodie, and John, we had a great meal in Thessaloniki at a place called Mama Luca's. It was beef short ribs, and it was, I'm not even sure what all was in it, but uh, Thessaloniki, the modern city, is a food destination. It's also an art destination, and so well worth the a visit, uh, even beyond some of the Bible connections and the archaeological connections. There's a cultural influence there, but I don't want to end on that. I want to end on uh, a really important connection that plays into what John was talking about in First and Second Thessalonians and this client patronage system. The idea that you paid homage to a patron and they provided a living and means and money and benefits to you was ingrained in the culture of Thessalonica. Well, that creates some problems when you start to introduce Christianity, because the question is now, who is going to become my patron? Who is going to provide for me? Who is going to take care of these things? And those are themes in the books of First and Second Thessalonians. So, John, I'll give you the final word to talk about that client patronage system and connections we can make in First and Second Thessalonians.
Yeah, just maybe a brief mention of that, and then Brian, also before we go, I want you to give us some of your personal impressions in our talk, just a minute about that, about how important this place is as a place to visit. But yeah, so when you think about the fact that Rome had at their disposal so much money that they could give, and particularly cities that were loyal to them, unfortunately, a sort of social system began to exist where people were uh, given money to essentially go around and applaud the senators or applaud the rulers of a city, and to just be in support of the government, and really didn't have a job. Um, and so you've got a huge working class of people, then you've got a large aristocratic group of individuals, some of which are basically just being supported by the government, but in an aristocratic way. And so some say that that may have uh, been a problem for some of these Christians who were more aristocratic, perhaps, that had obeyed the gospel, and now they are expecting that they are going to be supported. And so you've got some in the church who are not working. And Paul says, if a man won't work, neither let him eat. So is that part of the issue that Paul addresses about people not working? Or is it that some believe that the uh, the Jesus is going to come back very soon, because an important part of the lessons that were preached by Paul and other Christians and by Jesus himself was his coming. But Jesus said, "I'm going to come." He's going to come in judgment, as he did on Jerusalem, but that wasn't his final coming in that sense, of when every eye would see him. So maybe is that what Paul is having to address, people who just weren't working, but one thing is for sure in First and Second Thessalonians, Paul is saying this to the people there: don't be involved in idol worship that was so prevalent in your city. He reminds them of what it really means to be a Christian, right? To abstain from idol worship and to not be involved in fornication. Don't live like the world, but then also, in essence, though he doesn't use this word, but be good citizens. Work, be busy. Don't be busybodies in everybody else's business, but you live a good life before other people in this community that is diametrically opposed to you. And as a result of that, you're going to have an influence on the world. You're going to be a light to people. And and we didn't even really even touch on, and it's another subject at another time, but the man of lawlessness and their view of that and the connection with the very things we're talking about here with regard to the Roman Empire, because I believe the man of lawlessness was this system of the cult emperor worship that the Christians were facing. So we'll talk about that another time. But think about all what we said as you read through First and Second Thessalonians and how that may have a part in our appreciation and understanding of the text. Now, the last thing I want to mention, then I'll just leave it with you, is don't forget that in this city that Paul went to, that all these cultural influences and all these things occurring, he goes and he establishes the church and then has to leave quickly. But Brian, he never forgets them, and he's always thinking about them, and he's deeply concerned about their development, about their faith, about their growth, and their work. And so he stays in contact with them. Even though he has to leave, even though he's pressured to leave and he ends up down in Athens, he corresponds with them. And what a lesson for all of us today. What a connection to make that there's a church there today in Thessalonica. There's a few scattered around in the Mediterranean world, not nearly like they are here in the U.S. And I'll just have to admit, I've not been one that has been as conscientious as I should in really kind of reaching out. We've done that some. Of course, we've church in Athens, a church at Nazareth in Israel, but we're trying to be more conscientious of that and how important it is then for us, whether there or here, when we work with the congregation, to see it through to its end, to help people in every regard, to not lose sight of what they need, the encouragement that they need, the encouragement that all of us need. And Paul understood that, and he writes them knowing that they are a minority in this larger world of paganism.
John, that's a great connection. And you mentioned the impressions, and I kind of almost imagine, and I don't know how impactful this is or whatnot, but you talk about visiting Thessaloniki, modern Thessaloniki, ancient Thessalonica, and it's almost a metaphor or an analogy or whatever literary device you want to use for Christianity, and that there's these small places of archaeological significance, and yet they speak volumes to what happened there and to all the history that's happened. Well, I feel like a lot of Christians, and especially you mentioned the Christians in Thessalonica today, they may feel that way. They're only a very small part of what can be a very large and very modern city. But if we will uh, make ourselves known, talk about the things that are important in life, they can have an outsized impact to their relative size. And that's kind of how the archaeology sticks out in my mind in Thessaloniki, but it's also what we're called to be in terms of a church where our impact can be much more than just our footprint. Um, Even though we may be few, we can have an outsized impact.
Second Thessalonians, when Paul writes, he's encouraging them because of the changes that they have made. But in First Thessalonians, there's such a beautiful, beautiful point that's made that connects us back geographically into maybe how we all started this and where this is located. But he identifies some specific places, and one of them is Macedonia. What is that? That's a province of where Thessalonica is the capital. And so he says, from you sounded out, First Thessalonians 1, verse 7, you became examples to all the believers in Macedonia. So even in their difficult situation, this small congregation, with all of its pressures, ended up influencing the entire region, this entire province of Macedonia. So he says that from you, all those of Macedonia and Achaia, that's now the province south of where Athens is and other places, they heard the word of the Lord. So under great stress and under all of these cultural influences and pressures that we've been talking about here in the world that they found themselves in, those Christians still had an impact on the world for good. And man, let that be a lesson for all of us today. We can do it. They did it. And we can go far beyond just our small community in affecting the lives of people.
John and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. One of the missions of Bible Passages is to deliver as much free Bible content to people as possible, but we can't do that without your support. First, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Second, you can leave a comment on this video or this episode so that we know that you're listening. And third, if you feel compelled to give, you can do so at biblepassages.net/give. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next episode.